Hey, cats and kittens, it's Doc Hammond again, and I have another story for you. I've told you before that my family's had a lot of unusual pets, and I thought I'd tell you right now about another one of those. In fact, I think it's probably the most unusual pet we've ever had in the family. And I'm talking about Squiffy the Trout. Now, this is really a story about my dad, and Squiffy was his pet. Going back to when I was a boy, we had a cottage over on Hickory Hills Lake, right here in Lunenburg, and we would spend a lot of time there. And Dad was an avid fisherman. He loved to go out in his little outboard boat and fish. He would take along his fly rod, and he had a little 3 horsepower Johnson motor that he'd attached to the back of his little wooden dory, and he would putt off across the lake and look for all the best places to fish. One of the spots that he really liked was near this tiny little island. There was a great big pine tree that grew out of the middle of it with some blueberry bushes around it. And sometimes in the summer, that was a good place to go pick blueberries, too. But Dad was out there one day, and he was casting into the lily pads near that little island with the pine tree in the middle. And he happened to throw his line right in next to this one lily pad that was a little more purpley than the others, and it had a little tear in the side that was the shape of a tear. And no sooner had he cast his line in there than he got a bite, and he reeled in the line, and at the end of it was a beautiful little 3-inch trout, too small to keep or to eat, but there was something about that little trout that struck Dad, something special. It had the most beautiful little symmetrical dots down its back, little freckles, had a lofty brow, and a really intelligent expression on its face. And instead of squirming when he picked it up to take the hook out, it just sat there quietly in his hand and looked at him. And as soon as he put that little trout back in the water, it would stick his head out of the water and look at him and bob his head up and down as if he didn't want Dad to leave. He was just so friendly that Dad took a plastic bucket he had in the boat, dipped some water into it, and dipped it underneath the little trout, set that bucket back in the boat, turned the boat around, and motored back to our cottage. Well, there at the cottage, he had an old wooden barrel that had been cut in half, and he had an idea. He had heard that if you catch a trout young enough, you can train it and get it to do all sorts of tricks, just like you might train a dog. So he cut a little hole in the bottom of the barrel, and he got a cork to fit into that hole to plug it up, and then he filled the barrel partway with water. And he took the bucket that he had, and he poured Squiffy into that barrel. And every night he would go out, and he would take the cork plug out and let a little more water run out of that barrel, just getting the trout used to living with less and less water. Well, finally, he took the cork out one night, and the last of the water went out. And by that time, the little trout had adapted so that he could actually breathe air. Now, one of the things that Dad noticed when the water was out of the barrel was that the pectoral fin, the side fin on this little trout on his right side, was just a little bit shorter than the one on the left. And as he pushed himself along on the bottom of that barrel, when he pushed with his right fin, he would veer a little bit to the right. And when he pushed with his left, he'd come straighter back into course. But because he had this kind of strange rocking motion, he looked a little bit like somebody who'd been drinking too much beer. And so as a result, Dad decided to name his little trout Squiffy. Well, he knew that Squiffy was ready to be trained now. So he would take him out and set him down in the sand next to the cabin, the cottage, and he would set up little obstacle courses for Squiffy to crawl through. Set up some twigs in his way so he'd turn one way. He'd set down a little rock in front of him so Squiffy could hop over it. And pretty soon, Squiffy had learned all sorts of commands. He could roll over, could play dead. But Dad still loved fishing. And it turned out that whenever Dad wanted to go somewhere, Squiffy wanted to go too. And so when Dad wanted to get back in the boat and take Squiffy with him, when Squiffy wanted to go with him, Dad decided he'd give it a try. He'd been very careful in the house. Squiffy would follow him everywhere, but he was a little uncomfortable if Squiffy would follow him into the bathroom because he was afraid he might get in the bathtub and all that hard work would go right down the drain. He was also a little bit nervous about taking him out on the water again, but Squiffy didn't want to be separated from Dad, and so they would go out fishing together. And Squiffy was a huge help to Dad because he knew where all the best fishing places were. And he would sit up on the seat in the bow of the boat, way up in the front, and he would adjust the position of his body to point in the direction that he wanted Dad to turn the boat in. And Dad discovered if he followed Squiffy's directions, he would come back with a whole lot of fish. But Dad was also kind of a mischievous, playful kind of guy, and he loved Squiffy, and sometimes when you love somebody, you like to play games with them and tease them a little bit, and that's exactly what Dad would do. When Squiffy would try to point him in one direction, sometimes Dad would go in a different direction, and poor Squiffy would get really flustered with him. He would hop up and down on that front seat because he was so upset, and he wanted to get Dad's attention and get him to go where he's supposed to go. Well, this went on for some time. They went out fishing together again and again and again. But one day, Dad started teasing Squiffy, and Squiffy got so upset that as he hopped up and down in his frustration, he actually fell overboard. Well, Dad tried to reverse the motor on the boat and turn back, but he was too late. By the time he got back, Squiffy the trout had drowned. Well, Dad brought Squiffy's body home, and he was very, very sad. He dug a little grave for Squiffy in the garden and buried him there. He carved Squiffy's name on a rock and placed that on the place where Squiffy was buried. We knew how upset Dad was. We tried to convince him that he should go out and fish for another trout and train another trout because he'd proven that he was really good at that. But Dad had really loved Squiffy, and he decided that he just couldn't try to catch another trout. And in fact, he never went fishing again. And I've never been much of a fisherman because I could see how hurt Dad was by all this. But Squiffy the trout is a favorite family memory of ours and another one of the unusual pets that we've had in our family.